From London, I'm Rochelle Travers, and this is The Standard. It's been a bit of a week for Sir Keir Starmer. He's been feeling the heat over reportedly receiving substantially more gifts than any other MP since becoming Labour leader. There's also been added backlash after Sue Gray's salary was revealed. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff earns £170,000, which is more than the actual PM himself. Elsewhere in government, in an exclusive interview with The Standard, the Transport Secretary has vowed that unions won't stop them from fixing the railways. Louise Haigh says they're going to modernise outdated work practices on strike-plagued railways and get trains running on time. I'm now joined by our political editor, Cecil. Nick, you secured an exclusive interview with the Transport Secretary. What did she have to tell you about their plans for rail reform?
Well, this is very interesting because the new Labour government adopting a very different tactics in dealing with the rail unions compared to the previous Tory administrations. Now, the ASLEF Train Drivers Union and their members have settled a 2-year pay dispute after a 15% pay offer over 3 years. And this has caused misery to London commuters and other rail users. So this dispute has now been settled. And basically what the Labour government wants to do, they want to work with the unions rather than having this confrontational standoff. And so in theory, this looks like a more sensible way to go forward. The government, the Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, she told me that they still want the unions to reform and ditch some of their outdated work practices, the rosters, which make it more difficult to run services, some very strange and old-fashioned rules about training on new trains when new trains come in, which basically can take drivers away from services for up to 18 months. So she is saying that basically that this is period, in her words, of peace now, industrial peace. So there's no longer this conflict. And she sees this a way now of trying to progress Labour's renationalisation plans to try and make the trains run more on time.
Is Louise Haigh not potentially risking angering the unions with her comments and potentially causing further disruption?
I don't think so, no, because I think he's taking a far more conciliatory approach. She's saying that the government wants to work in a collegiate way with the unions. Now, the big question is, can you work in a collegiate way with some of these unions? Some unions definitely are very much up to working with their employers. But the ASLEF and RMT union have time and time again shown themselves to be very militant and to put their members' interests ahead of those of the travelling public. You could argue that's the work of the role of unions to defend their members' rights and pay and work conditions. But very often, it's been the London commuter who's been left suffering.
Your interview with the Transport Secretary was wide-ranging, and you discussed a number of topics relating to British transport. What else did she have to say about her plans for the future?
Yes, so certainly there was a number of interesting points in this interview. There's been some debate about whether the HS2 high-speed rail line would end at Euston, when it comes down from Birmingham, or at Old Oak Common. I think she hinted that actually it will end up at Euston, although there's some decisions still to be made over tunnelling. There's the third one where Heathrow is now backing on the agenda, or certainly is kind of creeping back on the agenda. And she was actually highlighting that when the government will be looking at this, they'll be looking at the potentials for economic growth, but also, in her words, crucially, whether it will meet the UK's climate change commitments. On a slightly smaller level, there's the issue about e-bikes and their batteries exploding. Not a huge number, but a worrying number of cases of this. And she's stressing that the government is looking at bringing in new legislation to try and deal with this problem, which she says is largely down to people buying e-bikes or batteries imported from abroad, which fail to meet safety standards.
Sir Keir Starmer has had a busy week, to say the least. Sue Gray's salary has been revealed, which has been quite controversial. And there's also fears over a potential conflict of interest with the amount of gifts he's been receiving. Just tell us more about that.
Yes, well, so there are a couple of stories involving Keir Starmer and Number 10 running this morning. Probably the more serious issue is the one about his Chief of Staff, Sue Gray. Now, it emerged yesterday through the BBC that she's paid £170,000 a year, apparently, which is actually more than the Prime Minister. Now, this is not particularly unusual that for senior civil servants to be paid more than actually their political leaders, even though it does seem odd. It happens on a number of occasions. But what is more interesting and more worrying for the government is that someone's possibly inside number 10 is now very much leaking information which appears to be seeking to damage Miss Gray. And obviously she's a key part of Sir Keir Starmer's inner circle, and there seem to be people who are very much out to get her. There's also some controversy over the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case. He looks very much like he'll be leaving Downing Street soon. There's talk of tensions between Simon Case and Sue Gray. There are often tensions inside Downing Street because key decisions have to be made, and they're obviously these are senior heavyweight public sector figures who want to get their own way. But it's come at a very early time for Sir Keir Starmer's government. So this has raised some eyebrows to have at this level of rumblings of disunity already happening. It doesn't compare, though, to what was happening during the Tony Blair Gordon Brown years, where you actually had the Chancellor and the Prime Minister very much at odds. So that there isn't that rift. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves get on far better than Blair and Brown did, but clearly not all is well inside number 10. The other issue facing Keir Starmer is the gifts he's been receiving. Keir Starmer is a huge football fan, an Arsenal fan, and he has been getting hospitality from Arsenal and from the Premier League. It's all been declared, so it's all on the books. There's nothing secret here. But there's a question that arises, is there potential conflict of interest if the government is taking measures to bring in a football regulator of sorts? Now, the football authorities are opposed to this in many ways. So could Sir Keir Starmer be influenced by the hospitality he's been given to sway his views on a football regulator? I don't think this is a huge issue, but I think the Prime Minister may start to be wary about too many of these stories happening. Because once there's a series of these stories, it gets more damaging for the Prime Minister. We've also had the issue about his wife Victoria's clothes, some clothes that were gifted to Lady Starmer, and there's question marks about whether they were properly declared, as should happen. I don't think this is hugely damaging at the moment, but it's certainly an issue which, if it rumbles on and on, then it may start to erode some public confidence in the system.
Let's go to the ads. Coming up in part 2, our Chief Political Correspondent, Rachael Burford, explains the central London buskers row that is heading to court.
They say that buskers are causing a statutory nuisance to their workers as they're getting to work on this big office they have on Leicester Square. And they say, Westminster Council should have sorted this problem out.
The Standard Podcast will be back in just a moment. Welcome back. A familiar sound for most Londoners there, music from one of the city's many buskers. But when does busking become too much? Europe's largest commercial radio company, Global Radio, are taking Westminster Council to court over Leicester Square buskers in a first-of-its-kind case, saying the noise it's causing is a nuisance to workers at its office there. Here with me now is Rachael Burford, our Chief Political Correspondent, to explain the case in more detail.
So Global Radio, which I think is Europe's biggest commercial radio owner, they own stations like Heart, Capital, Classic FM, LBC, Smooth, among others. They are taking Westminster Council to court over buskers outside their offices in Leicester Square. They say that buskers are causing a statutory nuisance to their workers as they're getting to work on this big office they have on Leicester Square. And they say, Westminster Council should have sorted this problem out. And because they haven't, they're taking them to court under the Environmental Protection Act, which is quite unusual because it's a piece of legislation that's usually used by councils to prosecute, persistently noisy neighbours or fly tippers. So it's very unusual for a private company to use this legislation to take a local authority to court like this.
Some people might argue that Leicester Square isn't exactly going to be a serene place for an office anyway.
Well, no, obviously, Leicester Square is a sort of world-famous tourist site. You've got millions of people moving through there every day, workers, tourists, people commuting through there. I mean, yes, it is a very busy place. But there have been a lot of complaints about buskers in that area, not just the noise, but also, them blocking pavements. Because obviously you don't just have singers there, you have people performing on BMX bikes, juggling knives, doing all those sort of things. So in 2021, Westminster Council did actually put in place new rules that mean buskers need a licence to perform there, and there's certain pitches they're allowed to perform in Leicester Square. However, there have been accusations that certain street performers are sort of flouting those rules and performing without licences and not adhering to what the council has put in place. Global Radio is taking the court action, but there have been complaints from other businesses previously about the actions of the street entertainers around there. The Hippodrome Casino has sort of complained publicly about them before. So, there is obviously a problem where you've got a lot of businesses and a lot of people, just trying to get to work. But obviously the buskers say, well, we're working too, it is our job, and they do. They kind of provide a service. Lots of tourists come to London, they do visit Leicester Square, and they do enjoy seeing the dancers and singers and street performers in that area of London.
And if Global win this court case, could this potentially have repercussions for buskers around the city?
Well, yes. So Westminster Council has pleaded not guilty, saying, it's basically doing all it can. And there is a trial scheduled for early next year. Now, we don't exactly know what will happen yet if Westminster Council do lose this. And I think there will be sort of mediation talks ongoing between now and January before the trial is due to take place. But there is a consultation sort of ongoing at the moment about, new rules for buskers, potentially banning things like amplified music and things like that. So it could maybe sway the council to crack down a little bit harder on some of these street performers. There's been a lot of pushback from the street performer groups saying, they do need to make money, that it's already harder now for them, because they have to have card machines, etc., because people don't carry cash as much anymore. So there has been a sort of brewing row for several years over this issue.
You can read more about these stories and others on our website, standard.co.uk. And that's it from this episode. This podcast will be back tomorrow at 4 p.m.